Renaissance Annunciation art places Mary before us at the moment when the world holds out to her a very particular course of action that we already know she will take up. But that does not change the fact that the choice before her in this moment, we are shown, is to take up the world as it opens itself to her or not to do so. These scenes give us a Mary who is responding to that choice. And whether she seems to pause and in her signature style takes this event into her heart and ponders it, or whether she reacts more animatedly and ambiguously to this moment, neither the choice nor the outcome will ever change. Yet even though we may think that we know what Mary's life means now and will mean later, these works require us to approach them not as something, the meaning of which we already know, but with a sense of openness and wonder. They are a record of an act of taking up the world, of going out into the world into a future of possibility, and it becomes that again every time a new viewer encounters it. And in this way, the artwork matters to me because it necessarily takes me outside of myself into an engagement not just with another being in the world I find myself in, but also with that other's own attempt to give shape and substance to the act of opening themselves to the meaning that they perceive in the world. And artwork offers me the chance to become more humane in the way that Friedrich Nietzsche uses that term. Now, perhaps some of you are saying under your breath right now, what could Nietzsche possibly have to say to me about being humane? Isn't he like a nihilist and stuff? Isn't he the Antichrist incarnate? Well, I'll let you judge for yourself after you hear something that he said. In what I consider to be a remarkably insightful, moving statement, Nietzsche describes in The Gay Science, quote, a new feeling that he hopes will become available to us humans in the future. I don't have time now to explain why he thinks we need to have a new feeling in our world, but perhaps you can infer maybe some of the reasons when you hear what he has to say. This new feeling is a feeling of profound happiness. Quote, that happiness is Nietzsche's word, that Nietzsche looks forward to, but by no means is this feeling one of heady optimism or excitement. I apologize for the lengthy quote to follow, but I hope you will see why my reading of it is justified by the time I finish. Quote, this is actually one color of this new feeling. Anyone who manages to experience the history of humanity as a whole, as his own history, will feel in an enormously generalized way all the grief of an invalid who thinks of health, of an old man who thinks of the dreams of his youth, of a lover deprived of his beloved, of the martyr whose ideal is perishing, of the hero on the evening after a battle that he has decided nothing, that has decided nothing, but brought him wounds and the loss of his friend. But if one could endure this immense sum of grief of all kinds, while yet being the hero, who, as the second day of battle breaks, welcomes the dawn in his fortune, being a person whose horizon encompasses thousands of years past and future, being the heir of all the nobility of all past spirit, an heir with a sense of obligation, the most aristocratic of old nobles, and at the same time, the first of a new nobility, the like of which no age has yet seen or dreamed of. If one could burden one's soul with all of this, the oldest, the newest, losses, hopes, conquest, and the victories of humanity, if one could finally contain all this in one soul and crowd it into a single feeling, this would surely have to result in a happiness that humanity has not known so far, the happiness of a God full of power and love, full of tears and laughter, a happiness that, like the sun in the evening, continually bestows its inexhaustible riches, pouring them into the sea, feeling richest as the sun does, only when even the poorest fisherman is still rowing with golden oars. This godlike feeling would then be called humaneness. Again, I think this is an amazing passage. As a kind of aside, I will even say frankly, though Nietzsche would choke to hear me say this, that I don't believe I've ever read anything that better comprehends, if not the full mystery, of what Jesus needed to feel and be in the Garden of Gethsemane in order to atone for humankind's sins and sorrows, than at least that portion of the atonement that I need to aspire to in my smaller way of being. Only God and his Son can know what and how I feel. That's one of the things that distinguishes them from you and me. But that doesn't mean that we still shouldn't try. But back to Nietzsche. What Nietzsche envisions here in his very human-centric formulation is that to be humane, which I take to be a way of being human in the very best and complete sense, I must make the paradoxical effort to think beyond myself when I think about myself and my existence. We can call this effort compassion and try to draw ourselves towards others, to understand and perhaps be with, and even more important, be for others in their sorrows, pains, or for that matter, joys. But again, it is only an effort and one that is destined to fail if we think that we have the ability to know what and how another human being feels in suffering or in joy, as they feel it in the moment and particularity of their circumstances. I think we can only be with others and try to turn the purpose of our existence into one which is for others, but we cannot be another. But Nietzsche reminds us that how we conceptualize what it means to be human must align itself with my actual lived experience in the world in relation to others. And what that means, first and foremost, is that to be human, we must always take into account the fact that we are fundamentally and always beings in bodies. This constitutes the primordial situation of my being. My consciousness, my awareness of myself, others, objects, all of the things that make up my world, is rooted in my experience in the world, and this experience is in turn rooted in my body. I am fundamentally an embodied being, and any attempt I make to understand or explain what, where, why, how, or even that I am, must build itself on this fact of my being. And this fact of our being necessarily implies a second one. We are fundamentally, always, solitary embodied beings. So the question that he poses here is, how can I know what it means to be human, even to be me as an instance, an aspect of being human, when I can only experience being me? And when I'm doomed to project my own necessarily partial sense of what it means to be me as I experience it onto my more general sense of what it means to be human. Again, this is why the question of freedom or possibility that I posed at the beginning of this talk is so important to us. I can't fully understand what it means to be human, in all senses, including free, because I'm limited in my understanding of what is possible for human beings to be. And so what Nietzsche tries to hope for in this predicament is that we might come to a sense of being human that is an enormously generalized one, he says. I think what he means by this is that we try to come to an awareness of what humans feel, and to do so with a sense of responsibility, of obligation, a readiness to take up as a burden we willingly bear all that humans can feel, have felt. We try to open ourselves to all of the feelings and experiences, including the ones we have not felt or experienced ourselves, in our conception of what it means to be human. To know what it means to be human, we must orient our lives not to avoid, but to welcome and endure the hopes and the fears, the losses and the desires, and all of the contradictions that make up our lived experience with each other. But we cannot experience everything, and so we are doomed to be limited in our understanding. This makes Nietzsche greedy, that's his word, to know what it means to be human by living more than his own life. As he says in his aphorism, the sigh of the search for knowledge. Oh, my greed, there is no selflessness in my soul, but only an all-coveting self that would like to appropriate many individuals as so many additional pairs of eyes and hands. A self that would like to bring back the whole past, too, and that will not lose anything that it could possibly possess. Oh, my greed is a flame. Oh, that I might be reborn in 100 beings. Whoever does not know this sigh from firsthand experience does not know the passion of the search for knowledge. But even though I will never know what it means to be Mary when I gaze into an Annunciation scene, and this is what brings me to what I really want to talk about, is I still want to claim that Annunciation art is important because it has to do with thinking about Mary. And Mary is a really important person for us to be thinking about. I would say that at least for Christians, Mary is someone all of us should be thinking about. And I realize what happened to Mary in the Protestant Revolution and ways in which we're still kind of nervous about making a big deal out of Mary, but I think we ought to make a big deal out of Mary. And actually, Muhammad does quite a bit of thinking about her in the Quran, too. For him, she's really the only exemplary woman that sacred history has to offer us. As near as I can tell, she's right up there for him, with Noah, Moses, and Joseph, as well as her own son, in showing us the way to please God. For Christians, beyond being simply the mother of the Son of God, she has become the ideal woman par excellence, and as such has both exercised tremendous influence on our thinking about Christianity and about women, and also has become an image that itself registers and embodies all of the ideals, sometimes in all of their glorious contradictions, that our culture could possibly project onto one person. But even for non-Christians, Mary is at a minimum an important person to think about, because she represents a sense of possibility for humans that very few other figures, in any culture or system of thought comes close to. Mary will commingle her essence with the being who created her, to create a new being who is both creator and created, ruling and ruled, divine and human, immortal and mortal, spirit and physical matter. Though this experience does not fundamentally change Mary's own physical being, the meaning of what she is as a mortal being is profoundly changed, elevated, because the greatest of all beings chooses her to create his only begotten Son, through whom he intends to do his greatest work, redemption, a work which in its own right most fully manifests the being of God. In our more familiar Christian terms, Mary is admitted through the otherwise impenetrable wall that separates God from his mortal fallen children. She is readmitted into the presence of God not just to worship him or receive instruction, but to join with him in the most intimate act available to any two beings in all of creation. An act made more intimate, by the way, because God's spiritual essence, as the Renaissance would have believed it, can penetrate to her very core. But again, although this is what Mary's life means right now, what a work of art does is make me try to think about how Mary's experiencing this event, even before she has time to think about it and decide what it means. You know how this is, how the experiencing of something, even something that you will later realize has become incredibly meaningful, doesn't reveal its full meaning at the time. Mary doesn't even know how to think about this moment, does she? The real answer to this question, actually, is that we don't know. We know nothing of Mary before this moment. And as the history of reading, painting, composing her story shows, we really want to know about this girl that God himself chooses to bear his Son. What has she done? Who is she that God would choose her for his helpmeet? There is probably no other figure from Scripture, except perhaps the Lord himself, whose story has been so imaginatively expanded the way Mary's has. It is out of this fascination, at times an obsession, that a past was made for Mary. Actually, the most interesting feature for me about this past that has been invented in the past was the belief that Mary, pure creature that she must have been, had chosen virginity as her way of being in this world in accordance with the beliefs of the day, the Platonic Christianity's beliefs concerning the body and sex. We have every reason to believe that when a Renaissance painter shows Gabriel coming to Mary to tell her that she has been chosen to bear God's Son, that this really is a confusing and perhaps frightening surprise to a woman whose understanding of the meaning of her own being did not include becoming a mother. And what I really like about Renaissance versions of this phenomenon is that this surprise and confusion is not a purely mental or spiritual phenomenon. It's physical. It's about how Mary reacts and thinks initially about this moment with her body. Perhaps this may have motivated Fra Filippo here in the painting you've been looking at for a bit to show Mary initially twisting away. But my favorite invocation of this phenomenon is this version by Lorenzo Lotto. Mary isn't twisting away, she's ducking. She's ducking a bolt that a very Zeus-like father is aiming at her. And one of the favorite parts of this ride is the little cat who's getting out of the way too. My very favorite version of this scene is Sandro Botticelli's Cestello Annunciation. And I would like to conclude by looking at this one carefully with you to see what it tells us. Botticelli gives us Mary, apparently disquieted by the presence of the angel. But from our first glance, the work brings us into energetic forces of motion displayed in Mary's contortions, and I think this will help us see it even a little better. I am struck, as Karl-Heinz Ludeking is, by the painting's, quote, reciprocal play of forward and backward moving, attracting and repulsing gestures. Mary moves both towards and away from the angel, and it is within an image of this motion that we could say her story in this event takes place, as we understand its sequence of events from Mary's being troubled at his saying when Gabriel enters and salutes her as someone highly favored among women, through her question to the angel's news, "How shall this be, seeing that I know not a man?" to her final statement, "Be it unto me according to thy word." But as this painting displays the scene, Mary seems to engage in what seem to be opposite responses. Which comes first? Does she first open herself to the angel because, and this was actually believed by some of Botticelli's contemporaries, she's used to seeing angels? Then move away because what the angel tells her about God's plans for her goes against her desire to remain a virgin? So she initially recoils at the idea? Is this how Botticelli understands her inquiry, her motion away from, but her readiness to accept God's will displayed as her motion towards? Or did she first recoil at the angel's intrusion, and now we are seeing her act of recoiling reversing itself as she prepares to submit? Is this knee, her knee there, her right knee, beginning to bend into a kneeling posture of submission? This painting in itself presents us with no self-evident plot, no obvious sequence, because her opposing motions happen simultaneously, and that's how bodies work. In fact, could not this picture achieve the wholeness of the story by simply fixing itself as an image, not a plot, of endless back and forth motion, a frozen image of God converging with woman? But the bent knee, I didn't mean to do that. But the bent knee seems to propel our interpretation onward because it puts her in a state of disequilibrium. We see this knee in other versions of the scene, but here there is a fluidity of motion that Botticelli constructs in a kind of energetic circularity. And circularity becomes the geometric principle of the problem I am posing, both in interpreting this painting and in my larger attempt to understand what it means to be. Circles start and end everywhere and nowhere, and they travel in both or either direction. Her motion away produces her motion forward, and vice versa. Yet Botticelli has drawn a circle ultimately to violate its circularity. He interrupts the circularity with this very angular knee, which echoes the angel's very angular knee that almost seems to be a forward motion propelling this, inviting us to put a great deal of interpretive weight on the knee, as Mary does here literally. Geometrically, two intersecting lines, two converging forces, which is precisely the opposite principle from that of the circle, Produce this knee as an image of the story of the Annunciation in general. God intersects with a human, and it produces an interruption in her life, a disruption of her life's course, but one that gives her a life's course that God intended. Not only does God converge with mortals in this knee, but the image converges with narration, for how we account for the bending of this knee will indicate the logic, the comportment, the ontological determination we appeal to for our sense of the story's wholeness. We do not escape the way that the story has been determined as a story. As a dynamic narrative image, this knee moving her in two directions at once suggests the probability that her emotion will end in her kneeling. Yet the pure physicality of Botticelli's style raises further questions. Is it the sheer power of Gabriel's message that initially overwhelms her, thus making her knees buckle under the weight of what she, with her intelligence and perceptiveness, can sense to be a great cross she'll be called on to bear? Or is it that her knees buckle with the prefigured metaphorical pain of a sword in her side, figured here in the force of Gabriel's own knee, that Gabriel's own knee projects, which crashes into her knee? Does Botticelli deliberately skip right over the end of the immediate story and project another end, with that tree coming out of the angel's head, that prefigures another end, when she at the foot of the cross will helplessly witness the death of God, her Son? Does she conceive at this moment his birth and his death? We might see a simultaneous birth and death figured as well in the tree, again, almost growing out of the angel's head, in contrast to the solid angularity of the floor, the column which first helped us see her knee, the tree, and in some ways Gabriel's knee on both sides. Mary's fluid knee prophetically narrates the physical, earthly cost of being God's handmaiden. When we look at this painting, our questions, and therefore our way of understanding and conceptualizing the meaning of this story, are asked by Mary's body. In the story, Mary thinks, reflects on the message, and the manner of its delivery. But in the painting, Mary's body does the thinking in response to the world as it opens itself to her. And as Botticelli has painted it, it can only think ambivalently. Now, I might stop and just add here that it's on this basis that I think its most profound appeal is to us. Because I don't think it's necessarily by analogy that her body means something to us, but at the same time, it's the fact that that's something that we share with her as bodies, that we can understand what's going on here. From our own experience as embodied beings, we know what happens if the knee bends, what the body does. And it's actually out of that experience that we can come to an understanding of what the body says, what the body is doing, and therefore what it might say when we start to construct meanings on it. But again, as Botticelli has painted it, there's an ambivalent kind of thinking here. Though the painting seems to call out to us to finish it, Mary isn't kneeling yet. She has not gestured quite yet, so that we can confidently say with the resources the work itself gives us what will happen at its end. The work of history in this painting is not to realize the end for which she is destined in being and in history, nor is it to fulfill the prophecy that religion has decreed for her. If it is her destiny to be a part of the story that articulates the promise of hope, then it is also fundamental to that destiny that she takes her being from a story that also holds out the promise of despair as an equal possibility. Hope and despair are both ends of the story that must coexist as possibilities to give the choice for devotion its power and the desire for salvation its urgency. Botticelli's Cestello Annunciation ensures that Mary's obedience and God's grace, as certain as they are, cannot and must not be comprehended by us or anyone else as inevitable for the love of God. Thank you.